Hi, in this video we are going to discuss about how do we garbage an object. In our earlier video we discussed more in detail about object referencing and object identity. Garbaging the object also falls under the object referencing concept. So we are going to learn how Python handles the releasing of the object memory. It is an automated functionality of Python. So garbage collection is going to be automated. We are not going to deal with the garbaging of objects. So here, if you look at the steps that's involved in the garbaging of object is when a referenced object is no longer referenced by any variable name, the symbolic name which I'm talking about, if no variable names are pointing to that particular referenced object, then the object state is moved to an orphaned state. Orphaned state is a state where there is no dependency for that particular reference object, and ideally that object is eligible for garbage collection. So once an referenced object is moved into the orphan state alone, the object is eligible for garbage collection. But how it is moved to the orphan state? When the number of variables referencing to that object stays 0. For the same object, okay, for the same object, you can have multiple symbolic names to be mapped. But at the end, when there are no reference to that particular object exists, means when it comes to the 0 number of a variable that is pointing to that object, then the object is eligible for garbage collection or moved to the state of an orphan state. The object will be garbage collected as soon as the reference count, okay, the variable which is pointing to that is called as a reference, right? So when the number of reference comes down to 0, then immediately the object is eligible for moving to the orphaned state, and from there it is garbaged. So let's take some example. I have an object of float object, and in that I have a value called 3.14. Then I have another object called Boolean object, and in that I have a value called true. And I have another third object, and it is a string object where I have a value called bird. These are all objects. Please be noted that these are all the objects of the respective type. Now we need the symbolic names to point to these objects. So let's take the example of x. X is a variable name or a symbolic name which is pointing to the object called float. So how many references are there for this object? One reference, that is x. Then I have a variable name called y where the y points to the same x. Y is pointing to the float. Okay, so when the y is pointing to the float and x is also pointing to the float, then the object is actually carrying two references in it. It is carrying two references in it. So when it is carrying two references in it, then the object is still not eligible for moving into the orphan state. The next thing is I am removing the reference of y and mapping it to the Boolean object. Please be noted, the y's reference which is referenced to the float is now disconnected and pointed to the another object called Boolean, a Boolean object. Now, still your float object is carrying one reference, that is x. X is still referencing to that particular object. It is not coming down to the 0. As we stated in the definition, when the object reference comes down to 0, then the object is eligible for the garbage collection. But right now, still you have x variable pointing to float, and y which was pointing to the float got disconnected and mapped to the Boolean object. Great. Now I have another flow where y is going to be pointed to the bird object, and so the Boolean object is going to be disconnected completely. The y is going to disconnect the reference to the Boolean object and map to the string object, And I'm going to declare one more variable called z or z, and that z is going to point to the same bird object. I'm sorry, the string object. Now what happens? X is pointing to the float, y is pointing to the string, z which we created now is also pointing to string, but the only object which is having a count of 0, initially it was started with 1, okay, right now it becomes 0. When it becomes a 0 count of reference, then the object is eligible for moving into the orphan state, and from there it gets garbage collected. So if you look at this flow, the object boolean is now completely garbage collected because there is no one to refer. It is orphaned. Okay, there is no dependency for that particular object. No one is referencing to it. So the object of that boolean, the boolean object, is eligible for garbage collection. When the number of reference count comes to 0, that's the important term to be noted here. So if you look at this, the number of count is 0. That's very much important. When your reference comes down to 0, then the object is eligible for garbage collection. Okay, so we'll see this in practical, but practically we cannot visualize whether it's getting garbaged or not, but we can experience the simulation of this slide there in the practical demo. Thank you.